What if the one letter that could change everything was never meant to be found? In a village that whispers more than it speaks, a daughter's forgotten truth lies buried beneath roses, silence and secrets too old to scream. But when the past knocks not with rage but with regret, what would you do? Would you dare open the door? It was a Thursday morning, touched by a delicate quiet that only an English spring could disguise as peaceful, mist still hugging the lower hedgerows, dew trembling on petals not yet kissed by full sun, and a breeze just soft enough to move chimes and curtains without disturbing the illusion of serenity. Elmsworth Hollow, the kind of village that had long slept in its own stillness, stirred gently with the sound of rakes, distant birdsong, and the occasional cough of an early cyclist. But by midday that illusion had begun to fray, not with alarm, but with the subtlety of unease, the kind that creeps beneath doors, settles in parlor corners, and rides the air between neighbors like an unspoken dare. Something was wrong. Arthur Langley, solitary inhabitant of Ashcroft House and a man whose charm was both deliberate and disarming, had been found dead in the shaded grove behind his home, his body lying askew beneath a wrought iron arch tangled with half-bloomed clematis, a single shoe missing, his eyes closed not in peace, but as if in denial. The gardener found him, or so he claimed. Langley had always kept a distance from village drama, and yet managed to remain the center of it, effortlessly. His manner was courteous, his wit refined, and his memory unsettlingly precise. He remembered not just people's names but their sorrows, their ailments, their quietly buried pasts. He never forgot a widow's anniversary nor a failed harvest's exact toll. The house he lived in was a story in itself, rooms full of inherited antiques, velvet drapes that never quite lost their perfume, and a grand piano that hadn't been played since the disappearance of his sister Clara, nearly 9 years ago. Her portrait still hung in the hallway, unsmiling, eyes heavy-lidded as if keeping watch over something more than just time. The doctor, pale and visibly rattled, declared heart failure, though admitted in hushed tones that the scent in the garden was unusual, not poisonous, not chemical, but old, ancient even, like forgotten ink and dried petals. But it wasn't the death that stirred the village to silence, it was the note. A single piece of thick creamy paper found in Langley's inner pocket, bearing no seal, no address, no signature, just a message written in ink so dark it looked almost wet. The garden remembers what you chose to forget. There were those who said Langley once loved a woman who vanished. Others whispered he'd been writing letters that never reached their destinations, and one woman, only known as M, had been receiving violets by post every year on the same day. When Miss Eloan Dray, the retired schoolmistress with a taste for detective novels, and a memory like glass, heard the news from her housekeeper, she said nothing. But she did something she hadn't in years. She went upstairs, unlocked a drawer hidden behind an old atlas, and took out a small envelope marked only with an initial. She held it for a long moment before slipping it into her pocket, and heading out toward the vicarage. By 4 o'clock, the drawing room was alive with murmurs and shadowed glances. The vicar's wife had prepared her best tray, lemon sponge, cucumber sandwiches, and elderflower cordial, but it did little to dampen the tension in the air. The ladies spoke in carefully chosen phrases, each sentence wrapped in civility, but sharpened by curiosity. Arthur always seemed too polite to be real, said Mrs. Beale with a brittle smile, stirring her tea twice clockwise and once back. And yet, murmured Miss Arden, the seamstress, there was something unfinished about him. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her cup down. More than just nerves, Miss Dray noted silently. Then came the theories, his trips to London, the sound of piano music from his house late at night, the time a child went missing near his garden, and was found hours later at the gates, crying but unharmed. No one dared say it aloud, but something had always lingered around Arthur Langley, something unspoken, something buried, maybe even by him. Miss Dray watched not the words but the silences, the glances too quickly averted, and the way Mrs. Ashcroft clutched her pearls whenever the note was mentioned. No one questioned where the message came from. No one asked what the garden might remember. And yet, When the seamstress excused herself early, her face pale, her bag clutched tight against her chest, Miss Dray followed with her eyes, just long enough to catch a smear of ink on the woman's sleeve. Sometimes she said softly, as if to herself but not quite, "A death is not a conclusion, it's a door left ajar." And as the wind rustled once more through the hedges and the scent of crushed violets rose into the air, the garden behind Ashcroft House stood still, waiting, it seemed, for the next secret to bloom. As she turned to leave, her voice dropped to a whisper, barely brushing the air between them. "Not quite," she murmured, not to anyone in particular, and yet the weight of her words seemed to settle in the room like a mist, clinging to corners no broom could reach. For she hadn't been the last woman he kissed, and, more than his sudden death or the bruised hue behind his ear, was what stayed with Miss Althea Crowthorne long after the parlor had emptied, and the tea had cooled. There are truths that do not announce themselves with fanfare, and in a village like Dunley Moor, where secrets are preserved like pickles and gossip ferments like wine, a whisper could split open more lives than a scream ever could. Miss Crowthorne had learned to trust the unintended comment, the remark that slips through habit and habitually betrays more than intention ever dares, and what Miss Deirdre Price had spoken, half lost in her breath, carried the subtle cruelty of an open drawer one isn't meant to notice. Deirdre, with her modest tailoring shop, and her unforgiving reputation for straight seams and silent judgments, was not the kind to rhapsodize. And yet she'd once been the sister of Beatrice, the girl with laughter like wind chimes, and a smile that didn't survive her 20th winter, to pneumonia, they claimed, or nerves, or something unspoken that people only gestured at with lowered eyes and over-stirred tea. That night, as rain feathered the glass panes, and the fireplace painted shadows like whispers across her walls, Miss Crowthorne sat clipping browning petals from a vase of moon lilies, and replayed those 7 words. She wasn't the last woman he kissed. There had been others then, recent, perhaps urgent, perhaps unwilling. And in the aftermath of Gilbert Farrington's sudden death during his morning walk, that changed the shape of the whole affair. The doctor had said it was a stroke, perhaps a misstep on damp ground, but had noted a bruise just behind the left ear, oddly placed for a simple fall, as if he'd been startled or struck, not enough to fracture, but enough to suggest resistance. And while the village folded inward with the peculiar choreography of rural fear, curtains drawn early, errands run in pairs, and more than one bridge game suspiciously cancelled, Miss Crowthorne noticed what others ignored, that Lydia Thorpe, the pianist from London with too much perfume, and a laugh too loud for a morning town, had not been seen since Tuesday, that Mrs. Ellison, whose roses had long enticed Farrington into her garden for afternoon cordial, now left her gate unlatched, as though waiting for someone who wouldn't return, and that Miss Price had begun working longer hours, humming more often and smiling less, her fingers quicker, but her stitches uneven in ways that only grief or guilt could sew. Gilbert Farrington had been the sort of man whose courtesy masked calculation, who remembered women's anniversaries but forgot their husbands' names, who gifted lilies to the widowed and olives to the married, and whose voice made even cynics pause before refusing him. He was never indecent, only precise, his flirtations wrapped in decency, his departures always timed before affection could ossify into expectation, and while many had admired him, few had truly known him, and fewer still had understood that charm, when unchecked, could be a weapon just as sharp as cruelty. Miss Crowthorne had long sensed the pattern, the way his attention lingered just long enough to ignite longing, but not long enough to answer it, and now, in the vacuum left by his death, that absence felt engineered, not accidental. As she slipped on her cloak and stepped out into the thickening dusk, a plan was already threading itself together in her mind, not an accusation, not yet, but a visit, a quiet question about a monogrammed handkerchief never returned, a torn hem oddly familiar, and a mirror that had once reflected something more dangerous than affection. In places like Dunley Moor, the truth didn't arrive with headlines or scandal. It bled in under locked doors, stitched itself into seams, and waited, always waited for someone like Althea Crowthorne to unpick it with care, and a needle sharper than most realized. In the village of Windermere, where the fog clings like an old secret, and the chiming of church bells often feels more like a warning than a call to prayer, a silence took root that did not belong. It was not the peaceful hush of a Sunday evening, or the lull before rain, but a silence that followed a disappearance, the kind that seeps into conversations, tiptoes behind closed doors, and lingers like smoke in old curtains. Eleanor Bryce, the unassuming seamstress known for her flawless hems and quiet disposition, had not opened her shop in 3 days, and while her absence might not have stirred alarm in the grander places of the world, in Windermere, where everyone is noticed even when unnoticed, it was the kind of absence that grew louder with each passing hour. Mrs. Linton, a widow whose lace curtains were her eyes to the world, swore she saw a figure slip out Eleanor's back door just past midnight. Tall, deliberate, his coat foreign, his gait too confident for someone unfamiliar. No one took her seriously at first, but as always, it's the ignored whispers that harden into truths. When the constable was finally persuaded to break open the door, Eleanor was found seated as if merely resting, hands folded, a teacup untouched beside her, no sign of struggle, yet her eyes stared ahead as though something had unspooled within her long before death arrived. The scent of lilacs hung impossibly in the air, a floral presence too cruel for autumn, and far too distinct to be coincidence. A single strand of deep green silk was caught in the drawer of her writing desk, slightly ajar, as if someone had reached for something they shouldn't have. It wasn't the kind of clue you'd expect, no blood, no note, no forced entry, but to Judith Blake, the village librarian with eyes that seemed stitched from intuition, it was as loud as a scream. Judith, long widowed and longer underestimated, had lived quietly among books and broken hearts, but she never forgot faces, nor patterns. She recalled a first edition of Shelley's poems that had recently returned to the library, no borrower's name, no due card, but a margin note scrawled in red. Not all beauty fades with time, some must be erased. It was chilling, it was deliberate, and it did not belong to Eleanor's hand. As Judith traced Eleanor's final days, she found threads, invisible to others, that linked her to 2 other women. Marian Elms, found face down in the village brook with her shoes aligned side by side on the embankment, and Vera Langley, who was said to have taken her life by gas, though the door to her flat had been unlocked and the kettle still warm. Both women had lived alone. Both had once, however briefly, been seen in the company of Henry Valance, a former portraitist with a gift for painting women in the way men are taught to romanticize rather than understand. Henry, now a recluse, resided in a vine-choked cottage on the edge of Windermere, where he claimed to spend his days studying moths and brewing herbal teas. Judith, cloaked in quiet purpose, visited him under the guise of delivering town records, but in truth, she came to look, not at him, but at what he had hidden. His home was immaculate, disturbingly so, the kind of clean that speaks not of order but of control. Above his fireplace hung a large canvas turned to face the wall, a gesture that did not ask for privacy, but screamed of concealment. Henry served her tea with a strained smile, and as he spoke of nothing in particular, Judith noticed how his fingers twitched each time she mentioned the name Eleanor. She left as dusk thickened the air, and the scent of lilacs, faint but unmistakable, clung to her coat like a warning. That night, she sat alone by her lamp and reviewed it all, the thread, the poem, the silence behind Eleanor's eyes. She thought not of murder, but of ritual, a pattern, intimate and precise, cloaked in kindness, and left unfinished, like a half-sewn dress waiting for a final seam that never comes. And as the village of Windermere slept, unaware of how many shadows they lived beside, Judith knew with growing certainty that this was no isolated tragedy. Something, or someone, was repeating an old story in new ink, and she, with a lifetime of forgotten memories and untapped fury, would be the one to tear the pages open before another woman was left to bloom beneath a scent that did not belong. The morning after Charles Everleigh's funeral dawned unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that clings to places where truth lies buried just beneath polite smiles and hollow condolences. Even the crows on the vicarage roof seemed to hold their breath, though mourners filled the cemetery path with black umbrellas, and murmured sympathies. The sorrow in their voices felt borrowed, as if they mourned not the man, but the mystery that had followed him like a shadow all his life. Two figures lingered at the edges of the ceremony, one within the tangled familiarity of the Everley household, the other barely visible against the mist rising from the hedge-lined lane, watching with an intensity that went unnoticed by most. Neither wept, neither prayed, and their detachment might have dissolved unnoticed into the grey drizzle of that morning, had it not been for a single sentence, murmured at the very moment the crowd began to disperse into the aching hush that follows an unresolved death. Miss Irene Holloway, walking just behind the grocer's faded green awning, turned to her companion, and in a voice softened by something heavier than heartbreak, said, "It wasn't me he kissed last. Someone else was there before he died." It was not bitterness in her tone nor jealousy, but a quiet resignation, the kind that comes when a truth arrives too late to be confronted. Miss Ellery, who had paused beside the old postbox pretending to adjust her handbag, froze, not because of the words themselves, but because of the eerie silence into which they had been delivered, like a thread pulled tight across an open wound. That kiss so casually revealed, unraveled weeks of whispered assumptions, the long walks, the exchanged glances, the borrowed records returned with a ribbon too plain for romance, all had suggested Irene was the center of Charles's final affections. Yet her voice, flat and hollow, suggested otherwise, not a broken heart, but the pain of having believed in an intimacy that had never truly existed. That afternoon, Miss Ellery took the long path through the woods, past the old bell tower and the forgotten garden gates, making discreet inquiries under the veil of social niceties. From Mrs. Alden, the Everley housekeeper, she learned that Irene had returned a parcel that very morning, a set of vintage records Charles had lent her, tied not with silk, but with an ordinary red velvet ribbon, as if erasing all traces of sentiment. There was no note, no parting word, just the cold precision of someone closing a chapter they never wrote. That detail alone struck Miss Ellery. For most young women, tokens of affection, real or imagined, are clung to like relics, but Irene had returned them as if they meant nothing, as if the moment had passed before it was even lived. That evening, with the lamp burning low and rain ticking gently against her window pane, Miss Ellery unfolded the small paper she had taken, not stolen, she told herself, from Charles's coat before it was sent to the undertaker. The ink had bled slightly from the damp, but the words were still visible, their simplicity haunting. "I remember the orchard, and how the wind carried her perfume through the lilacs." There was no name, no date, but the handwriting was unmistakably his, and the line itself not poetry, but memory, perhaps even confession. The orchard had been gone for years, replaced by a concrete extension of the vicarage, but the lilac tree, that lilac tree still lived on in the memories of a certain few who recalled the war years, when blackouts disguised midnight meetings, and romance was often a flicker in the dark, rather than a declaration in daylight. The next morning, under the guise of needing a hem repaired, Miss Ellery called on Miss Ashcroft, the aging former schoolteacher, whose house overlooked the remnants of that very orchard. Miss Ashcroft greeted her with polite detachment, her frame thinner than remembered, her eyes sharper than expected, and as she reached for her sewing needles, her fingers trembled just slightly, the tremor of someone not surprised by the visit, but wary of what might follow. As the needle passed through fabric, Miss Ellery mentioned the lilac tree, how it once stood with such graceful defiance near the orchard wall. There was a pause, brief but weighty, before Miss Ashcroft replied, "Funny, the things we remember when the trees are gone." Her voice cracked at the edges, brittle with memory. Miss Ellery said nothing more, but as she left, she noticed a photograph, tucked behind the sewing basket, a black and white image, its edges curled with time, of a young Charles Everley, standing beneath a lilac tree, beside a woman whose face had been carefully scratched out. That single act, the erasure, said more than words ever could. Something had happened beneath that tree, something binding and unfinished, and whoever she was not Irene Holloway. And so, as the wind whispered once more through the village lanes, and the scent of lilac returned to the air unseasonably early, Miss Ellery walked home, knowing the story behind Charles Everley's death was no longer a simple question of who he kissed last. but rather, of why that final kiss had mattered enough to keep secret, and what it might have cost to conceal a truth planted decades ago beneath a tree that still, in memory, bloomed. Miss Elwood's hands hesitated only for the briefest moment, her needle suspended mid-air, as if caught in the gravity of something unsaid, before resuming its slow, deliberate path through the linen she'd been hemming for nearly an hour. Her voice, when it finally emerged, was not addressed to Miss Marple directly, but rather floated outward like breath on cold glass, soft, wistful, and so faint it seemed to come from some forgotten corner of memory. "It bloomed too early," she murmured, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the window pane, where the old pear tree now stood bare and brittle. "That last year, the frost came sudden and hard, blackened it before the petals even had their moment in the sun." The statement, half metaphor and half memory, lingered in the room like a ghost, its relevance unclear, yet its emotional weight unmistakable. Miss Marple, ever the student of quiet sorrow, noticed the tremble in the woman's fingers, the way her thumb hovered too long over the fabric, before resuming its rhythm. Something old had surfaced, something buried not in soil, but in time. The silence that followed was not empty, but pregnant with the ache of years, and it was in that hush that Miss Elwood, as though pulled by an unseen thread, spoke again. "My sister Eleanor," she said with a voice now stretched thin by recollection, "used to sit beneath that tree, a book always in her lap, her eyes always watching the gate." There was a pause, a shifting of breath, waiting for someone who never seemed to understand the value of arriving on time. Miss Marple did not interrupt. She knew well that grief, when stirred, must be allowed its own pace. "Eleanor was younger than I, brighter. People said she had a dancer's poise, and a dreamer's heart. They also said, Edmund Carrick saw it first, saw it before she knew what it meant to be wanted." Her hands folded the cloth now with slow, precise care, as though holding something fragile, like bone or glass. He'd send her letters in those early war years, long burning letters, full of talk about futures, about moonlight on water, about love that would survive the distance. Her eyes, glassy and dry, stared not at Miss Marple, but at something long vanished. "I only read one, by accident. It came weeks after he'd left for the front. He told her she made him feel human, even while the world was turning to ash." Her voice caught slightly, then steadied. "But he didn't come back to her. Not really. He came back, changed, quiet, with a different purpose." Miss Marple, who had seen enough wars to understand that men often returned as shadows of themselves, leaned in slightly, but said nothing. "Eleanor went to Brighton after that. She said it was for work, but I think she was running from silence. When she came back, she was thinner, her laughter had gone brittle. One morning, she didn't wake up. Pneumonia, they said. But what they meant was that she'd given up, that she'd been emptied out." Miss Elwood's voice faltered, not with sorrow, but with exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a story too long. "I doubt Edmund even remembers," she said finally, her composure returning like an actor slipping back into costume. "Men don't forget on purpose. They simply have no need to hold on the way we do. They shed what burdens them, and the rest of us, we gather the pieces, we fit them into drawers and letters, and memories, and carry them until they blur." Miss Marple said nothing, but the shifting in her eyes was unmistakable. The mystery that had begun as a casual curiosity, a letter found, a name whispered, was reshaping into something deeper, something tinged with mourning and unfinished truths. Eleanor Elwood's story, long silenced, now fluttered at the edges of discovery like a trapped bird. Miss Marple had always believed that women remembered love through fragments, the first touch, the first promise, the first betrayal, while men catalogued love only when it disrupted their lives. It was in that imbalance that heartbreak often bloomed. Margaret Hensley, quiet and musically inclined, with her uncertain smile and skirts that brushed the ground like apologies, had stirred something long dormant. It hadn't taken long for Edmund Carrick, now aged and seemingly benign, to notice her presence. He always had a fondness for gentle women, especially those who hadn't yet learned to guard their hopes. During one of the vicarage's evening recitals, Margaret had confided to a friend, quietly with pink cheeks and trembling hands, that Mr. Carrick had spoken of futures, of possibilities, of perhaps even a ring. Mrs. Chilcot, whose intuition was as keen as a bloodhound's nose and only half as subtle, had told Miss Marple that Margaret was expecting a proposal by spring. But spring came and went, and with it Edmund's warmth had cooled into polite detachment. The ring was never offered, only imagined, and when Margaret finally dared to ask about what had been promised in the shadow of that pear tree, Carrick smiled with the same hollow charm he once used to undo Eleanor's trust. Somewhere between Eleanor's final breath and Margaret's first hope, history had begun to repeat itself, and Miss Marple, watcher of patterns and keeper of silences, understood that some stories demand to be uncovered, especially when the ghosts they contain have never truly been laid to rest. Though the residents of Marbury-on-Thorne had resigned themselves to the quiet inevitability of Gilbert Henley's passing, there was an oddity to his absence that seemed to echo more than it should have, as if something essential had been disturbed rather than simply lost. To most he had been a man of refined habits and guarded affections, with a wit that masked more than it revealed, and a loneliness he never acknowledged aloud. But to Miss Althea Langford, an aging observer of human frailty and precision, there was something deeply off-kilter about the timing of his demise. In the final weeks before his death, Gilbert had grown increasingly evasive, often deflecting direct inquiries with wry half-smiles and cryptic remarks about unfinished business and timings best left to fate. When asked directly about the matter of his estate, he'd simply said, "A legacy, complicated, but no cause for worry," though his tone, light as it seemed, carried the faintest tremor of disquiet. And then on the Sunday after the funeral, Miss Lysandra Bell, who many believed had quietly hoped to become Mrs. Henley, returned a silver brooch he had given her, its clasp untouched by wear, in an envelope that read only "no longer mine to wear." There was no sign of resentment in her expression, only the kind of grief that stems from quiet humiliation, the pain of a promise dissolved not in anger, but in silence. Such betrayals wound differently, Miss Langford knew. They leave no open scars, only the dull ache of something that had once dared to hope. But it was not just emotional wounds that concerned her. A faint discolored bruise had been noted behind Gilbert's left ear, an odd place for an accident, and odder still to be explained away as natural. While most of the village sank into polite mourning, a subtle shift had taken place. Mrs. Cordelia Finch, once a constant in Gilbert's daily rhythm, had retreated into peculiar seclusion. Known for her generous deliveries of garden clippings and her homemade preserves, Cordelia had been visibly shaken at the funeral, her hands trembling as she clutched her handbag like a secret too heavy to bear. It was not her grief that piqued Miss Langford's interest, it was her behavior 2 days later. Strolling along the narrow path beside Cordelia's garden, Miss Langford caught sight of a small smouldering bonfire near the edge of the property. There stood Cordelia, not with garden waste but with a bundle of folded letters and envelopes, their edges curling in the low, anxious flames. Her movements were hurried, almost panicked, and she failed to notice Miss Langford's silent passing. That afternoon young Peter, the telegram boy, casually mentioned having delivered a letter to Mrs. Finch that very morning, one postmarked from London but bearing no return address. Alone such a detail might have passed unnoticed. But when Miss Langford inquired gently at the post office, the postmistress, accustomed to discretion and gossip in equal measure, recalled that Cordelia had long received legal letters at irregular intervals, always thin, always destroyed, always unspoken of. What troubled Miss Langford now was the timing. Why burn a solicitor's letter after the man in question had died, unless the contents of that final note had revealed something dangerous, scandalous, or incriminating? Redmond's original pronouncement of cardiac arrest had served its purpose, offering a clean, unchallenged narrative to those uninterested in complexity. But by Monday morning, after conducting a more thorough and unprompted examination, the doctor paid a quiet visit to the vicarage, his face pale with a restrained urgency. While not strictly by the book, such detours were tolerated in a village where discretion was more valued than procedure. What he revealed was chilling. Gilbert Henley had died, not of natural causes, but from a fatal overdose of digitalin, a potent extract of the foxglove plant, which grew in profusion just beyond the very garden where the letters had burned. In small controlled doses, it could regulate a failing heart. In excess, it silenced it forever. And while accidents are always the first refuge of convenience, Miss Langford could not ignore the far more likely explanation. Someone had either misled Gilbert, or helped him along to silence. The dead may not speak, but the details they leave behind can scream, if one only listens closely enough. Arthur Bellamy's sudden soundless collapse was first dismissed as the inevitable end of a quiet, solitary life. An old man dying alone in his study, surrounded by books and the gentle ticking of a clock, but beneath that silence lay something disturbingly off-kilter, a sliver of unease that refused to settle. He had never complained of heart trouble, never visited a doctor, never shown signs of illness. Yet when Dr. Ellsworth reluctantly muttered that the post-mortem revealed traces of digitalis, a potent toxin that in the right dosage could slow the heart to a fatal halt, Miss Henrietta Clark, the village's ever-watchful observer, didn't gasp like the others. She merely asked a single question: could it be administered in a drink? The answer came quietly: yes, easily. Tea, wine, anything sweet, it dissolves without trace. Everyone knew Arthur's habits: morning tea with honey, and a single glass of red wine before supper, both prepared without fail by Mrs. Cray, his demure housekeeper, who after his death locked herself away in the upper rooms, and claimed a sudden illness that kept her bedridden. When this revelation was whispered within the vicarage among a few trusted villagers, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Miss Louisa Green, Arthur's longtime friend, didn't scream or speak. She simply swayed and sat down, her hands shaking in her lap as if the foundation of her world had cracked. Colonel Wexley, the retired military man, set down his teacup mid-sip without a word, his jaw tight and twitching. Miss Durant, who always embroidered quietly in the corner, froze mid-stitch as the word poison fell from someone's lips, her needle suspended mid-air, unmoving, like a clock stopping. Malcolm Hyde, who rarely spoke, asked in an oddly level voice, "Will there be an inquest then?" And Miss Clark, ever alert, noticed a flicker in his eyes, not fear but irritation, as if plans had been disrupted, not destroyed. Outside, the village itself began to change. Mrs. Holloway altered her morning walking route to avoid passing Arthur's home. Miss Fenwick now handed over exact change at the grocer's without pleasantries, and the usual chatter in the bakery dulled into a tense hush. Dr. Ellsworth later added that a small bottle of digitalis, an exact match for the compound in Arthur's system, had disappeared from Mr. Howard's locked medicine cabinet weeks earlier. The logbook recorded it under the initials A.B., a name belonging to no staff member or known patient. Miss Clark observed it all with the calm of someone who believed that murderers do not think like scientists, but like wounded animals, reacting from pain, fear, or rage, and that their trail lies not in evidence but in disruption. She noticed Mrs. Cray's shoes had a thin crust of mud from a part of the garden no one else used, that Colonel Wexley's hand twitched slightly whenever he reached for the whiskey decanter, as if fighting muscle memory, that Miss Durant's embroidery resembled the birthday gift she had once given Arthur, a circular maze, intricate and closed with no visible exit. In St. Aldhelm's Hollow, death does not arrive screaming. It moves like a cold draft slipping under doors, changing the tone of voices, the tilt of gazes, and leaving behind a silence too deliberate to be natural. And in that silence lies the real mystery, not in what was said, but in what was carefully left unspoken by the one person who knew everything, and had mastered the art of staying quiet. It didn't begin with a scream, nor a murder, but with a letter, hand-delivered in silence, slid beneath the warped wooden door of the old Ashwick House library, on a night when the wind stirred the trees like restless spirits and the fire refused to catch in the hearth. The paper was thick, like it had been lifted from another era, and the ink, dark red, not quite blood, but close enough to stir unease, spelled out a name no one had dared utter in decades: Clemency Vale. The household, long accustomed to shadows and forgotten corners, took little notice at first. It was Eleanor Pratt, the historian who had come to catalogue the estate for the village archive, who found it the next morning, resting on the Persian rug as if left by accident, though everything about its presence felt deliberate. Inside was not just a name, but a riddle, a reference to a missing locket inlaid with mother of pearl, said to contain something more damning than a secret. A handwritten confession signed by Colonel Francis Vale himself, who had vanished without a trace in the winter of 1948, after rumors of betrayal, espionage, and something far darker. That same day, Mrs. Denholm, the Colonel's once devoted nurse, now a recluse with trembling hands and clouded memory, was found lifeless by the fire, a crossword half filled in her lap, a porcelain teacup shattered near her feet. Though the doctor ruled it natural, Eleanor noticed the faint scent of lilac on the cold air, a scent impossible to explain in November. The village had long whispered about the Vale family, about a child born in secrecy during the war, never baptized, never claimed, passed from house to house with false surnames, and carefully forged school records. Eleanor's research uncovered a clue, missed by others, a hastily written note in the margins of a 1950 census ledger, one border unaccounted for. No further inquiry. It led her to the forgotten West Gardens, where a crumbling statue of Bridget wept moss and time, and beneath it, buried under layers of ivy and soil, she uncovered an iron box sealed with wax and carved initials. Inside it, wrapped in faded velvet, was the long-lost locket, heavier than expected, and tucked beside it, a brittle letter, the ink smudged, the words rewritten over and over before settling on a single haunting line, to be opened only by the bearer of my blood. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The discovery had unearthed more than history, it had disturbed something buried deliberately, something that did not wish to be found. Over the following days, she traced records of anonymous trust deposits made to Mrs. Denholm for years, all connected to an alias that led back to a girl, no, now a woman, known only as Mercer. The next clue wasn't in paper or ink, but flesh, a scar noted in every childhood medical file, shaped like a crescent moon behind the left ear. At the town's Remembrance Day ceremony, Eleanor spotted her, distributing poppies with calm precision, her face unreadable, her smile careful, measured. When Eleanor stepped closer, the woman turned as if already expecting her and murmured, "You've opened it, haven't you?" Her voice held no panic, only a patient finality. The perfume she wore wasn't perfume at all. It was lilac, faint but unmistakable, the same scent that had clung to the locket and the dead woman's shawl. It was then Eleanor understood, this wasn't a simple case of inheritance or identity. This was legacy, twisted, silenced, and deliberately erased. The woman, Mercer, had not come for revenge. She had come for recognition, and with her return came the unraveling of the past, the Colonel's disappearance, the nurse's quiet guilt, the war records purged of names, and the unanswered question of who had paid to keep the truth hidden, and why. And in the fading light of the library, as Eleanor stared once more at the red-inked name scrawled across that envelope, she realized that some letters are not delivered to inform, but to awaken. They said she had once been the kind of woman whose voice could quiet a room, not by authority, but by the weight of something older than experience, the unspoken knowledge that she'd seen too much and survived too narrowly to waste words on anything trivial. And in the sleepy folds of a town where the hedges grew higher than the gossip now dared to climb, her name, Eleanor Braith, returned not as a memory, but as an unanswered question scratched into the back of an war journal, hidden for years, behind a false panel in the rectory attic, the wood stained with time, and the diary's leather spine fraying like the edge of a secret long withheld. Its pages were delicate, brittle, ink smudged from a fingertip that had trembled, contact failed, package relocated, witness compromised, military code on the surface. But to Margaret Hensley, whose calm demeanor still disguised a razor-sharp mind dulled only by years of polite retirement and unspoken regrets, it was a ghost's whisper, a breach in the wall she'd bricked up herself decades ago. Eleanor had vanished under the velvet of wartime discretion, officially listed as lost to illness, unofficially forgotten to spare her family disgrace. Yet those who had truly known her, those few who had seen her eyes when she spoke of justice and danger in the same breath, had always suspected a deeper truth, buried beneath government letters and church condolences. Margaret remembered the final time she saw her, dusk settling over the garden, the scent of ash and roses mingling in the air. Eleanor in that slate-grey coat, her silhouette still against the dying light, clutching something beneath her coat with a mixture of fear and purpose. She turned back just once, not to say goodbye, but as if to silently beg her not to follow. It wasn't until the boy from the primary school stumbled over the rusted hinges of the old air raid shelter, while chasing his dog, that the past clawed its way up. From the roots of a rowan tree came a velvet pouch, inside it a photograph of Eleanor in uniform, her face younger than memory allowed, and a dried sprig of heather pressed beside it, still fragrant after all these years. No name, no date, just the presence of something left behind. Margaret, hands trembling but eyes sharp, knew instantly. This wasn't an artifact, it was a message. The war might have ended on paper, but for some it had left threads that had never been tied off, just buried. Eleanor had been pregnant. Not that anyone dared say it back then, not in church, not even in whispers, but Margaret knew, had known, and kept silent because silence had been the price of protection, of survival. The child had been sent to a cousin in Finchley. No papers, no name, just monthly parcels and a lie carefully polished over years. But now, with this photograph, and the note in the diary, the past began to speak again. And what haunted Margaret wasn't just the weight of what she'd hidden, but the thought that somewhere, someone was walking through life with Eleanor's defiant gaze, and had no idea whose blood burned in their veins. That night, as the fire crackled beside her, Margaret folded the diary page and placed it into an envelope with the photo and the heather, sealing them with wax like a confession. She would go to the old railway station, the place where Eleanor had last been seen, not to chase ghosts, but to stand where history had turned its face away. She didn't need to accuse anyone. The truth itself was accusation enough. Threads once pulled far enough reveal the shape they were meant to conceal, and Margaret, for the first time in a lifetime of silence, was ready to see what pattern they truly formed, because in the end, secrets are not buried. They are only waiting for someone brave enough to dig with both hands and ask, what if the past was never done speaking? They say the dead leave whispers, not footprints, and yet when Clara Elwood stepped into Elmsworth Hollow beneath a rain-smeared sky, suitcase in hand, and silence tucked behind her eyes, it felt less like an arrival, and more like something old returning in the guise of someone new. Her manner was gentle, reserved, almost too rehearsed, like a melody remembered rather than composed. And while the village welcomed her politely, a soft-spoken orphaned piano tutor with no real past and few belongings, it was Miss Rowena Clay who felt the cold ripple in the air shift the moment Clara passed the old war memorial, her gaze catching on a rusted plaque, as though something buried beneath her skin had stirred. There had once been another girl, decades ago, named Alice Marin, elegant, elusive, and too clever for the times, who vanished without trace after playing a final nocturne in the vicar's parlor, leaving behind a single crimson scarf, and a silence so thick it refused to fade with the years. Now Clara, with her distant smile and gestures too eerily familiar, walked the same paths, paused at the same ivy-covered gates, even sang the same forgotten lullaby Alice used to hum during dusk, details no stranger could fabricate. Rowena, no stranger to buried truths, began piecing together the intangible clues. Clara's reaction to lavender fields in bloom, her trembling hands when shown the broken music box once belonging to Alice, and her fleeting dream talk overheard in the cottage at night. Fragments of names, places, promises made in wartime. One evening, as thunder rolled low, and the village wrapped itself in the hush before storm, Clara returned to Rowena's cottage, not to deliver a scarf or return a book, but simply to stand by the fire, pale and unspeaking, clutching a faded envelope with her initials on it, though it was dated 1943, inside a dried violet blossom, a folded piece of bloodied gauze, and a photo of Alice Marin, not as a young woman, but cradling an infant with eyes identical to Clara's. "I don't remember this," she whispered, though her voice cracked like memory resurfacing from ice. That same night, a rusted lockbox was discovered buried near the ruins of the old train station. Inside it, a telegram never sent, marked classified, and a note in an unfamiliar hand. If she ever returns, tell her I never stopped waiting. Rowena understood then. Clara hadn't just inherited a past, she was the past seeking itself in the quiet edges of a forgotten village. No one ever confessed to placing the box, no one claimed the photo, and Clara, upon leaving the village weeks later, left her cottage keys hanging from a lilac branch. The same lilac Alice had once sat beneath with a man whose name had been erased from church records. Miss Rowena Clay, who now sat in the glow of dusk with the music box quietly ticking, though long broken, realized the truth hadn't returned with drama or bloodshed, but with the gentleness of an old song remembered in fragments. And somewhere across the moors, beneath gathering clouds, Clara walked alone yet whole, as if every mystery that once haunted her name had finally uncoiled in silence. Beneath the slow unraveling of that moment, it wasn't Lydia's identity that held the weight, it was the unseen hand that had chosen her as the keeper of something far older, something meant to surface not with noise, but with quiet devastation. And what haunted Miss Althea Cray in that silent realization wasn't the lockbox itself, but the intention behind entrusting it to Lydia, a woman with no past written in ink, only impressions left behind like fingerprints on old glass. Althea, with her careful mind and years spent understanding the soft fractures in human nature, had always believed not every letter was meant to be read. Some were written to survive the writer, a confessional whisper stitched together more for release than remembrance. And so, as she unfolded the brittle page Lydia had eventually handed her in tremors, a note once buried in the lining of a military coat belonging to Callum Stroud, the man who had died face down in the marshes with no sign of violence, only a silence too deliberate. Althea read with reverence. Read with reverence. It was not the handwriting of a stranger, not of a past lover or forgotten accomplice, but of Lydia herself, written in the liminal hours after discovering the photograph, of a child that wore her eyes, and a woman who wasn't her mother but had once sung her lullaby. The letter carried no bitterness, no accusation, only a speculative tenderness, an imagined vignette of two figures beneath a lilac tree, a man in uniform, and a woman in defiance, their kiss brief, their future cut short by silence and consequence. It hadn't been Lydia's memory, but it had become her inheritance. She'd written it not to be delivered, but to organize the grief that bloomed after learning the truth, that she had been born not of love, but of concealment, and raised not by design, but by necessity. She had tucked the letter inside a volume of Rilke, and forgotten it, or so she thought. And yet, it had turned up inside Callum's coat, folded carefully, worn at the creases, as though read and reread by hands seeking certainty. Althea read it twice, before realizing what disturbed her wasn't the letter itself, it was its presence in the man's coat, something Lydia swore she hadn't placed there. She was adamant, she'd never posted it, never even moved the book since the night she wrote it, and yet someone had taken it, someone with access to Lydia's things. Someone who believed the truth had waited long enough. Only one person fit, Eliza Penmore, the neighbor, the caregiver, the woman who brought honey tea and sympathetic glances in equal measure, whose interest in Lydia's family tree always felt too precise. Althea had watched her lately, not for what she said, but what she withheld, how her voice changed whenever the past was invoked, how she avoided the lilac tree whenever they passed it on walks. Pressed gently, Eliza had finally confessed. She had seen the letter during a visit, recognized Lydia's script, read just enough to piece together the truth. He deserved to know, she had whispered, before someone else decided he didn't. But what she hadn't considered, what none of them had, was what secrets Callum himself had been keeping, and what his reaction to that letter might have stirred in someone desperate to keep the past buried. If he had read it, and if he had planned to act on it, then his death might not have been an accident at all. Not a slip into the marsh, but a silencing. Some confessions aren't written to be shared. They are stolen, intercepted, weaponized. As Althea folded the letter once more, hands shaking despite the fire beside her, she understood the letter had changed nothing in being written, but everything in being found. Some truths strike like lightning, suddenly and violently, exposing everything in a flash. But others unravel slowly, like the delicate stitching of an old garment being picked apart thread by thread. And by the time you realize what's happening, the truth stands exposed, naked under a harsh, unforgiving light, impossible to cover again. Eleanor Gray's confession was just like that, not the result of anger, nor a move in some elaborate scheme, but the painful release of a truth long buried, silently decaying inside her like a secret disease. She hadn't wanted to speak against Evelyn. Miss Radley could sense that. It wasn't a letter written out of spite, nor the work of a petty soul, but a confession born from years of quiet guilt, nights of sleepless regret, and a voice that had been silenced for too long. One photograph stirred something, a locked drawer confirmed it, and that single crumpled note gave her the language she'd been missing. "I just wanted her to know, to understand," Eleanor had said softly, her eyes fixed on the old wine stain still visible on the table where Marcus once placed his glass. "Not for myself, but for Evelyn." Her guilt didn't stem from Evelyn's death, because that had already happened long ago. It came from the silence that followed, from the unspoken pain that echoed in her mind each night, from the subtle signs Evelyn once left behind in her too tight smiles, her trembling hands, her carefully worded praise. It came from the invisible scars left by Marcus's laughter, his charm, his unshaken control over a room, even while Evelyn seemed to shrink in the corners of it. Miss Radley didn't blame Eleanor, for she knew that guilt doesn't always grow where guilt belongs. Sometimes it festers in those who watched, who noticed too much, who felt too little too late. But that letter, Eleanor's confession, opened a door. Someone else had read it, and that someone didn't just understand the truth, they acted on it. Marcus was dead now, but the real question wasn't whether he had read the letter, it was, had someone else read it? Someone for whom that truth was simply too much to bear. Miss Radley kept coming back to one tiny detail, something everyone saw, but no one questioned: the faint bruise behind Marcus's ear. At first it seemed incidental, perhaps from a fall, or the side effect of unconsciousness, but Miss Radley had learned not to ignore the details, especially not ones that hide in plain sight. When it was discovered that the wineglass contained traces of digitalis, when it was confirmed Marcus never took sugar, nor medication, and there were no signs of forced consumption, she understood the poison didn't come from within. It was given to him, by someone so close, so trusted, so familiar that Marcus never suspected a thing. Someone who could stand beside him unnoticed, like furniture in his life. That bruise, it wasn't from a table edge. It was the mark left by a glass stem gripped too tight, or a panicked hand holding a jaw in place, or a wrist that didn't let go until soft lips swallowed a fatal dose. This wasn't the work of a monster. Miss Radley never used that word. It was the act of someone desperate to preserve something: love, legacy, identity. Someone terrified of what would happen if the truth in Eleanor's letter came to light. It wasn't just murder. It was an act of preservation born of desperation. And for Miss Radley, that faint bruise wasn't merely the sign of violence. It was a signature, a silent knock on the door of the only person close enough to Marcus to poison him without suspicion, the one always just a step behind him, always arriving with a gentle smile and a cup of tea, and that, more than anything else, made them the most dangerous of all. There is a certain alchemy to silence when paired with civility. It tempers suspicion, blunts accusations, and allows even the most unsettling truths to slip into the room unnoticed, like fog creeping through an open window. That was precisely the delicate balance Miss Radley conjured that afternoon, when she summoned 5 individuals to her drawing room under the pretense of a polite gathering, not a confrontation, though every detail, from the hand-stitched napkins to the precisely placed scones, was calculated with surgical intent. The table shimmered in soft afternoon light, a serene setting designed to mask the storm just beneath. No formal invitations had spoken of urgency, and yet each guest arrived as if pulled by the same invisible string of curiosity, fear, and unspoken guilt. Mrs. Halbridge entered first, wrapped in her usual armor of silk and etiquette, her expression so polished it verged on theatrical. Lydia Merrin followed with visible hesitation, her shoes making the softest taps as if afraid to announce her presence too loudly. She lingered at the threshold, unsure if she was meant to sit or stand, guest or suspect. Mr. Alan Crowe took his seat with slow calculation, his eyes moving sharply from face to face, an ex-solicitor, accustomed to control, visibly uncomfortable in a room where control had quietly shifted away from him. The housekeeper, Elspeth Dawn, arrived next, her apron freshly pressed, her composure so rigid it looked brittle. Her gaze remained low, her hands clasped tightly, as if hiding something not in her palms but far deeper, behind the years of silence and service she had rendered to the Ashcombe household. And then there was Nora Vale, young, bright-eyed, entirely out of place among the older guests, except for the uncanny way the light caught her profile, and echoed the features of a man long buried. Tea was poured with slow, deliberate grace. Small talk hovered like mist, harmless at first, murmurs about the early blooms in the garden, idle mentions of the parish fair, inquiries into Lydia's music and Mr. Crowe's nephew recently appointed in York. But beneath the surface, Miss Radley watched the dance of glances and half-spoken truths with the precision of a conductor. She saw the twitch in Mrs. Halbridge's eye when Nora asked about the cellar door. She noted how Elspeth's teacup trembled when the lockbox, long missing, was brought up in passing. She caught the subtle shift in Crowe's posture when the topic of medication arose, and the exact moment Lydia went pale as her long-forgotten letter was mentioned, not posted, yet somehow found in Gilbert Ashcombe's pocket, the night he died. Miss Radley waited until the air was thick with everything unsaid, and then she began, not with accusation, but with gentle observations that felt, at first, like casual recollections. A bruise barely visible, behind Gilbert's ear, explained away at the time as a stumble, but now, in this light, something else, the mark left when a glass is pressed too forcefully against lips unwilling to drink. The wine, poisoned with digitalis, had not been consumed voluntarily. Crowe's old prescription, missing from his drawer, his reaction curiously lacking in genuine concern, was another thread. Then came the letter, ink faded but words sharp as razors. It had been written by Lydia, never sent, never meant to be seen, except that it had passed through Elspeth's hands before somehow making its way to Gilbert. In it the truth uncoiled like a serpent. Lydia had borne Gilbert's child, and that child, Nora, now sat before them, unknowingly threatening to upend years of secrets and carefully maintained lies. Gilbert had drafted a new will, one that would legitimize Nora and alter everything. And that, Miss Radley's gaze turned to Elspeth, was the moment the tipping point had been reached. Elspeth, who had lived in Gilbert's shadow for decades, whose grief at Mrs. Ashcombe's death had seemed more personal than propriety allowed, had chosen silence again, this time laced with fatal intent. She had poured the wine, she had removed the tray, she had known that Gilbert, in naming Nora, would destroy everything she had silently claimed as her own. Her loyalty had not been to truth, but to the ghost of a life she believed she deserved. And so, in the quietest of moments, with tea still warm and sunlight dimming across the room, Miss Radley unraveled the past, not by force, but by simply pulling the right thread, exposing the fragile seams of guilt that held this roomful of secrets together. No one spoke. The truth, finally named, hung in the air heavier than any accusation ever could. And Miss Radley, her expression calm but unflinching, knew the rest would soon follow, because once the first lie is undone, the others rarely survive the silence that comes next. The rain had just begun to tap softly against the panes when Eleanor Hartley looked up from her stitching, the silence of the room deceptively calm, as if the house itself were holding its breath. The photograph that had gone missing, a framed memory of the late Mrs. Bellamy, had vanished not with ceremony but like a whisper swallowed in shadows, only to reappear hours later precisely where it had always been, unnervingly undisturbed. The wine in the decanter had been poured with care, not in haste, and someone, not out of celebration but calculation, had made certain it was drunk to the last drop. No footsteps echoed, no gasp broke the air. Instead, in the drawing room where time seemed to halt, Miss Elspeth Greaves spoke with the gentleness of falling ash, her eyes steady not with accusation but comprehension. "It wasn't hatred," she said, her voice brushing against the edges of the truth, "but fear, fear of being invisible, displaced, replaced." And indeed, fear Miss Greaves knew could be far more dangerous than malice. There are loves that never ask to be seen, loyalties that bind so tightly they leave bruises beneath the skin, silent devotions that wait in corners like forgotten furniture, accumulating dust and sorrow. She had recognized it the moment she met Mrs. Ada Finch, not the affection of a companion, but the reverence of a shadow tethered too long to the same flame. Ada had served Lady Bellamy since her first arrival at Edevan House, not as a maid alone, but as something more enduring, caretaker, witness, quiet guardian. Even after the lady's death, she had remained, folding the same linens with ritualistic precision, polishing the same silver comb that no longer touched hair, preserving presence in absence. But then Sir Jonathan, once a distant figure, had begun to show warmth toward Camille, the spirited young woman with a past tied in secrets, and a face that resembled a portrait long tucked away in the attic. When the truth of Camille's parentage came in a letter inked in trembling remorse, that she was Sir Jonathan's child by another, Ada had read it too, though no one had told her. She had watched him reading it, seen the flicker in his hands, and she had known that the girl would not just be welcomed, but might inherit the life her tower had curated like a relic. The halls she swept, the name she revered. Miss Greaves saw no villainy in her, only the jagged remnants of a love that had never dared to wear its own name. She had not hated Camille, she had feared the ghost she'd tended for years would be silenced by the arrival of flesh and blood. The poison had not been poured with a cold hand, but with one trembling with the loss of a purpose, and it was not confession but stillness that gave Ada away. She did not cry, did not plead, she simply stopped moving, like a clock no longer wound. Miss Greaves had always watched hands more than faces, fingers betrayed truths eyes knew how to hide. Ada wore gloves for everything, cleaning, serving, even tending flowers. But on the day the wineglass was found, a single print, faint as breath, marred its stem. Gloves had been forgotten, or forsaken, in a moment too human to be planned. And the next morning, when Ada arrived at the vicarage, her hands were red and raw, scrubbed to the bone, not out of cleanliness but guilt. Miss Greaves had said nothing then, but she knew, some acts of love wear the mask of harm, some silences scream the loudest, and some truths are buried, not in graves but in the careful smoothing of sheets, in the folding of grief, and in the fingerprints we fail to wipe away. It wasn't just the return of the box that unsettled Miss Hale, it was how it had returned that gnawed at her instincts. It hadn't been hidden, nor openly displayed, it simply sat there, placed with such quiet precision, that it felt as though it had never been removed at all, as if some unseen hand had restored it not just to its physical spot, but to its rightful place in memory. Its surface shimmered, but it wasn't merely the gleam of polish, it was a different kind of shine, one that suggested reverence, an intimacy that only someone familiar with every tarnish, every curve, every unspoken story etched into its silver could manifest. The box hadn't just been cleaned, it had been forgiven. Each stroke of the cloth, each lovingly wiped corner, felt like an apology, a penance carried out not with haste, but with emotional weight. And yet, one faint smear had remained, not an oversight, not quite a stain, but something quietly left behind, like a whispered confession. Miss Hale sensed it not with her eyes, but with something deeper, a pull in the chest that led her gaze instinctively to Mrs. Kenrick's hands, those still, folded hands resting gently in her lap. They were aged but not fragile, steady but heavy with untold things. These hands had once kept the house immaculate, commanding every surface into order, but with time, those same hands had buried truths too dangerous to name. Truth, as Miss Hale often believed, could never truly be erased. It lingers, like a fingerprint on glass, sometimes invisible, sometimes smudged, but always there, waiting to be touched again. And once touched, it breathes. Outside, as the village emerged from winter's hush, with mustard fields blooming anew, and morning mist curling along the ground like memory itself, there stood a small space behind the church, where a young sapling had been planted. No plaque, no ceremony, just a fresh lilac shoot, its stem so thin it swayed with the gentlest breeze, like it hadn't yet decided whether to stand or fall. That space had once held an old tree, a silent witness to stories buried too deep for words. Now, the sapling grew not just in soil, but in quiet acknowledgement. Miss Hale had casually mentioned to the rector's wife that the garden felt unbalanced, and perhaps something new should be planted there, but she hadn't elaborated. She didn't need to. Those who knew, understood that this wasn't just a matter of symmetry, it was a symbol. Some thought it a charming touch to the garden, but for those who truly saw, it was a quiet restoration, an unspoken truth, finally allowed to breathe. Eliza Fern had wandered to the spot just once and said nothing. She merely rested her gloveless hand against the young trunk, not out of sentiment, but out of something deeper, acceptance. Perhaps she didn't know the entire story, but she knew enough to carry the weight of it. She had inherited no name, no legacy, but she had been given something far rarer, acknowledgement. And acknowledgement asks for no justice, no revenge, only presence. The newspapers had mentioned the incident only once before vanishing back into gossip and cricket scores. But for Miss Hale the story hadn't ended. Mrs. Kenrick had been taken away without protest, as if she had been expecting the moment all along. Perhaps she knew that some truths don't shout. They fall like rain, steady and quiet, but impossible to ignore. Months passed. Normal returned like a carefully sewn veil. And then one day Eliza placed an old photograph beside her window, unframed, propped gently against a vase. It showed a young woman in a nurse's uniform, her face still, almost listening, as though it had been waiting to be seen. It was Beatrice. And now the picture belonged to Eliza, not by inheritance, but by truth. Later she slipped it into a slim silver frame, not fancy, not flashy, just enough to give it the dignity it had long been denied. Each morning sunlight would strike the photo, casting a long shadow onto the sill, not to mark time, but to reclaim it, hour by hour, memory by memory. Eliza didn't change her name, didn't leave town, didn't make claims. She didn't need to. What she had now was greater than any title or validation. She had a truth that didn't demand to be justified, only to be seen. Miss Hale believed that was the most precious kind of truth, the kind that doesn't scream but completes you. In that photograph there was a face soft with light, free from shame or explanation. And every year when the lilac tree blossomed, Miss Hale would pause beside it, and without a word, nod with the faintest smile, as if to say, "It has all come home now, and this time it's in the right place." She no longer searched for traces of herself in the faces of strangers, or in the reflection of cold mirrors. Those years of longing for a name, for a place where she might belong, had dissolved like fog under morning sun. What remained was something deeper, quieter, like a truth finally spoken aloud. She had found her mother not through inheritance or bloodlines scrawled on paper, but through the unraveling of a silence that had weighed down generations. And that to Miss Elowen Wren was enough. As she did each spring when the first crocus broke through the soil, she returned to her garden, not to tend to plants as a horticulturist would, but because pruning roses gave her thoughts room to breathe. Gardens, she believed, were where truth grew best, slowly, in silence, far from the noise of gossip and grief. That morning the air was rich with damp earth, and the wind whispered through the hedges like a memory trying to be heard. She thought of Edmund Roane, of the many versions of him that lingered in the minds of those he left behind. To some he had been gentle, almost tragic. To others, cold and unreachable, and both, she suspected, were correct. Mrs. Danvers remembered his careful handwriting and tender notes, while Elsie recalled the nights she waited for a kindness that never came. Each had been shaped, twisted perhaps, by what Edmund had offered, or withheld. Miss Wren had stopped believing in neat endings a long time ago. Life, she knew, didn't tie itself in bows. It frayed, it bled at the edges. But she believed in something else, in balance. In the idea that even the deepest secrets, if unearthed with care, could lose their power to haunt. The village had quietly returned to its routine, children practicing for the May Day dances, curtains fluttering in familiar windows, and Mr. Pendle's trumpet once again echoing from his conservatory, with more enthusiasm than skill. Even the old house on Heron Lane, once a place of whispers and half-truths, now bore new life, its ivy tamed, and shutters painted a hopeful blue. The scandal, like all storms, had passed, not forgotten, but folded gently into the patchwork history of the place. And on the far side of Miss Wren's garden, beneath the flowering dogwood, the white lilac tree she had planted last autumn stood poised to bloom. Not for her perhaps, her season was passing, but for someone younger, someone still learning that ghosts do not always come to torment. Some return simply to be remembered. She thought of Edmund's last letter, delivered weeks after his death, written in uneven script but with startling clarity. There is something beautiful I buried too deep, and I no longer want it to die there. It had not been a confession, but a final act of courage, a truth offered not in desperation, but in hope. And now, with the lies undone, and the quiet pain of the past brought gently into light, Miss Wren smiled, not with triumph, but with peace. Not all wounds leave scars. Some, if bathed in truth and given time, simply soften and bloom. And so, dear listener, another secret corner of this village exhales, not with thunder or grand revelations, but with a whisper, a song half remembered, a photograph, hidden behind another in a drawer, and a letter never meant to be mailed. These were the fragments Miss Wren followed, not the evidence of crime, but the traces of sorrow. In the end, it wasn't hate that drove the final act, it was something far more delicate, the unbearable fear of being forgotten, of being erased from the story of one's own life. We often think of tragedy as explosive, but as Miss Wren has shown again and again, it is often the silence that does the most damage, the grief left unspoken, the love never named. And now, with spring thick in the air, and the lilac preparing its quiet gift to the world, a daughter finds her mother, not through blood, but through understanding, through a truth that was never loud, only waiting. But let me ask you, if you had found that final letter, the one buried beneath floorboards and fear, would you have delivered it, or would you have left it in the dark, where no one would know? Let us know in the comments. We truly love reading your reflections, and your thoughts help others stumble upon these quiet stories too. If this tale stirred something in you, a forgotten feeling, a hidden question, or simply a love for mysteries stitched with emotion, share it with someone who still believes that truth is always waiting, just beneath the surface. And don't forget to subscribe for more Miss Wren-style mysteries, where answers are never loud, and ghosts don't wear sheets, they wear memory, and smiles, and